Test, test, test. I don't know how to tell if I'm live, but he said it's 6, so I'm going to start, I guess. All right, so we've been driving all day. We were in Atlanta this morning and drove to Columbia and then here, so we just got back. So if I'm tired or anything, that's probably why. So I am teaching part of the biography series that Caleb and Tommy and I have been doing for the past month or two. So Betty, you'll probably get a little bit of a repeat because I'm going to do another lesson on Charles Spurgeon. I did teach a Sunday school class, I think late last year on Charles Spurgeon, and incredible man, could probably teach many classes on him. So I tried to change things up and do a little bit different material tonight. Honestly, could probably do a few more classes, but we'll see kind of what we get through tonight. So that's what we're going to do tonight. I would assume most of you are at least familiar with the name and may know some things. I read his a biography of him to prepare, and there is a ton. He was a very busy person for his life and accomplished a lot. So plenty to talk about. Hopefully it'll be somewhat interactive, but there will also probably be a lot of me just spouting out crazy facts about Charles Spurgeon. So let me pray and we'll get into it. Father in heaven, thank you for this time to gather tonight together. I pray that you would bless the conversation and the teaching that we're going to have, that we would be encouraged by great men of the faith, that it would encourage us to be more earnest and more diligent in our work on earth. I pray that you would just bless this time together. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so I am going to start the discussion on Spurgeon by talking a little bit about football for a second, and specifically Tom Brady. Not that the two have much in common, but recently, if you at all follow sports, you probably heard Tom Brady retired after 20-something years in the NFL. Sam and I were sitting on the couch, and we follow football a little bit. We don't follow it super close, but Tom Brady's been a part of my life, football watching life for 20-something years. So it was a big deal. Heard it was like he might retire, he might not, and so then the news came out. We were sitting there, and on the TV, the little ticker at the bottom came out with the breaking news that he was indeed retiring, because the news came out that he was, and then he kind of retracted it and said, I didn't say that, and then it finally came out that he was. So we're watching this ticker, and it starts revolving through all of his accomplishments of his life, of his football life. And it was just the most amazing things that I didn't know. And so I'm going to read a couple of them and just hear kind of, the accomplishments of a 20-year career. So he has only person to win a Super Bowl in 3 different decades. So I guess the 2020s, 2010s, 2000s. He has played in and won more games than any quarterback in history. He has more Super Bowls as an individual than any other team in the NFL, which is pretty amazing. He retires the all-time leader in passing yards, touchdown passes, completions, regular season wins, playoff wins, and Super Bowl MVPs. And it goes on and on and on. There are just statistics that, when you put them relative to other football players, are just unbelievable for a single player. And I think there is a tendency that we all have to do this, where we are geared towards numbers and accomplishments. It's kind of how we measure success. It's how we measure business success. It's how we measure the value that someone brings to an organization or to a team or whatever. And so there's this tendency when we do these biography series for someone to get up and talk, and we tell you about the wonderful things that someone has done, And we kind of do the same thing, where we just hear all these accomplishments and we're very much wowed by them, and we kind of go about our day. And we do kind of the same thing as we might do with a sports hero, is we elevate them to this position. We're kind of just impressed by what they've accomplished, and then we move on. But there is a big difference between a Charles Spurgeon and a Tom Brady, probably multiple differences, but one that I want, before we go through this, to be thinking about. And that is the things that I'm going to tell you about Spurgeon that we're going to talk about. They had very much had an eternal impact, whereas the numbers that we talk about, the things that impress us today, they die with us. You know, they don't last. But the things that Spurgeon did, the numbers that we're going to talk about, the books written, the sermons preached, very much had an impact on the eternal lives of the people that he ministered to. And I don't want to lose sight of that there is very much a difference in those things. And so I think when we go through the life of Charles Spurgeon and the things that he did, the accomplishments that he had, they should carry a lot more weight than when Tom Brady retires and I'm wowed and impressed with all the statistics on the screen. Does that make sense? Does that feel good about that? All right, so opening question, just really quick. What do you know about Spurgeon? When I say Charles Spurgeon, what comes to mind? I think he's probably one of the more well-known theologians, but what comes to mind when you hear Charles Spurgeon?
His beard.
He did have a very nice beard. Yeah, so morning and evening devotional, if you couldn't hear, that was one of the best-selling, I think, devotionals probably of all time. But yeah, excellent. What else? Great preacher. Yep. We don't have any of his recordings, but a lot of his sermons, they would print them out and send them out, and he would edit them, one of his many jobs over the weeks. So we do have many of his written sermons, and so he was a great preacher. Anything else? Okay, so we're going to learn a lot tonight. Is there?
His credit of his church growth and prayer.
Yeah.
Faithful prayer of his
Yeah, I think if there were two things he was known for, it was his holiness and his prayer throughout his life. And he was known to be people thought he had literal healing powers of prayer because he would pray so much for the sick and for the people of his congregation and for church growth. And so we'll talk about some of the numbers of his church. Okay, so that's good. That's helpful. So I think what I'm going to do, I've tried to wrangle this into an outline. It was very difficult. It's probably going to not be super clear, but I want to go through just a quick timeline of his life, just through the years, just so you get an idea of kind of who he was and what he did through his life. And then we'll go through more specifics of his personality, his characteristics, kind of his church growth, and see where we get. So he was both the son and grandson of preachers, and then he had twin boys who both went to be preachers. And so he had a kind of a legacy of pastors in his family. He was essentially job shadowing his grandfather at 3 years old. So his grandfather would take him around and basically just do the office of a pastor. He would go visit with the sick, and he would go visit with people who may need confrontation or just a pastor to visit them. He would help prepare sermons and do these things at 3 years old. So he was picking up a lot of things pretty early. At age 3, he would sneak into his grandfather's library to pull Puritan books off the bookshelf and look at them. He couldn't read yet, but he loved looking at the pictures and was just immediately drawn to books. By age 5, he was reading those books aloud to himself and to the whole family. So he would pull these Pilgrim's Progress or whatever, and he would then read them aloud to the family. At age 5, he was caught several times preaching to his siblings, which my son does. But he was caught preaching to them and having them sit on haystacks and listen to his sermons. He was also self-publishing a magazine at like 5 years old to his family. So it was a magazine that basically had kind of the goings-on of their household, and then had some things about the Bible, and he would charge his siblings if they wanted to advertise in it. So if they wanted to advertise in the family magazine. So it's really funny, but at 5 years old, you see kind of this bent towards the Bible, but also kind of this entrepreneurial bent, which I think is really neat at such a young age. So he has other accomplishments over, as a kid, but at 15, just to kind of highlight that it was not just reading and preaching, he was solving math problems that were so complex that he was doing basically his uncle's job, I think who was an accountant or something. But he ended up solving this math problem that was then used by an insurance company for like 50 years in their calculations. So he was just an unbelievable mind in many different ways, and that was at 15 years old. And yet, despite this, despite the fact that he knew the Bible, he knew the Puritan writings at a really young age, he was not saved. So he was in a Christian household. He was kind of raised by his aunt, I think, and grandparents. And so he knew the Bible very well, but he was not saved yet, and it really drove him crazy. And so he looked and he looked and he looked, and he kind of went to all the places that he thought of that he could find salvation, and he would go to the academics and ask how I can be saved. And he was never happy with the answer he got, and he could never really figure it out. And so when I taught this in a Sunday school class last year, I did most of the lesson on his conversion. If we have time, we'll read it. I don't think we will. Really incredible story of conversion. He was essentially converted by what he called a really stupid man who was filling the pulpit during a snowy day when most churches were closed. And this man preached this very basic sermon and just kind of said the same thing over and over again, look to me and be saved. And he looked at Spurgeon and he said, you look miserable and you're always going to be miserable until you listen to what I'm saying. And Spurgeon was converted that night and had searched for this and finally found it. And it's just this incredible picture of one of the smartest men who had all of the head knowledge and yet still could not save himself. And then he's converted by this kind of simpleton, preacher who's not even a pastor, I don't think. So, great story. If you get a chance to read his account of it, it's really good. He describes, just in the way that he can, he just describes it so well. But so he's saved at 15, and then at 16, he's teaching Sunday school. So he joins a church, and they kind of see his gifts, and so they ask him to teach Sunday school. And very quickly, that grows into preaching his first sermon. And so they send him to preach his first sermon. And at 16 years old, he preaches his first sermon. They kind of yell at him during the sermon, how old are you? And they end up saying it's one of the best sermons we've ever heard. By 17, he's called to be a full-time pastor, and then he spends the rest of his life as a pastor. At 19, he was called to be the pastor at the largest church in London, and he would remain there for the next 38 years when he died at age 57. By 22 years old, he's the most popular preacher in England, and would regularly preach to crowds of over 10,000. Remember, this is before microphones, so he's doing all of this, either inside or outside. He would preach to crowds of over 20,000 multiple times. And then he basically lived the rest of his life as the pastor of Metropolitan Tabernacle. And so doing, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but a very visible job, but the job of a pastor for pretty much his whole life. So if you think about that, 22 years old, largest pastor in England, or largest church in England, just incredible. Especially his conversion story. And I'll go on and read in just a little bit some of his accomplishments and his writings and his sermons and the growth of his church, things like that. But the one thing to think about when you hear all of these things is he didn't have any seminary degree. He didn't have any education. And, didn't want it, there's some interesting stories about how he almost pursued it but didn't. But he accomplished all of this with no seminary education. And no college education. Okay, so that's just kind of a quick bulleted timeline. And so now I want to get into just who was Charles Spurgeon as a pastor and as a man. And like I said, I've tried to turn this into an outline. I don't think it really is a great one, but there are kind of three categories that I think of with Spurgeon and looking at his life and the type of man that he was. So one is that he was just extraordinarily gifted. He had an unbelievable mind. He was very smart. He read a ton. And though he was not necessarily known for his looks, they said that there are no angles about him. He was a round man with a big beard. And I think they said even early on he was just kind of this country bumpkin, that he wasn't well put together, but when he started preaching, it was incredible. But he was a very, very smart man, accomplished a lot without an education, and yet remained incredibly humble. So he prayed consistently for humility. He would constantly point his church not to himself and his personality, but to Christ. And he had this very high standard for how things should be done. So he had this motto that everything in the Lord's work be done well. So that was anything from his writing, his preaching, to how the church was constructed. He thought everything that is done in the Lord's work should be done well. And so he had a high bar for people in his church. So that's number one. Number two is that he was a principled and very loving pastor. So he was a pastor. He was a pastor most of his life, and that was his primary role. A lot of his writings came out of that. A lot of his books came out of that. But he was known kind of first and foremost for his earnestness. That was kind of, in the book, that was like the most consistent word, was he was an earnest man. He was driven, and he was always looking to win souls and to minister and to preach. And so he was very driven in that way. He has a great quote, and I'll read some of these quotes if we get to it. But he has just incredible quotes where he says things like, "I care nothing about fine language or about pretty speculations of prophecy or 100 dainty things, but to break the heart and bind it up, to lay hold on a sheep of Christ and bring it back to the fold is the one thing I would live for." And that was him kind of describing the purpose of their church. And so he was a very principled and dedicated pastor. He pastored during several cholera epidemics, and he would go out and he would visit in the homes with his people, and he would pray that God would protect him from getting sick. And I think he got sick one time, but he would go out. He wasn't afraid of that, and was very dedicated to his people. He was also not a fundamentalist. So he was a Baptist. He was also a Calvinist. He was definitely not a fundamentalist. So he smoked cigars very proudly. He did drink, and there's just a lot of really interesting debates in the book on what controversies that caused. But he felt very, like everything, he didn't shrug it off. He had a very defined view where he would say, some men can do to the glory of God what to other men would be a sin. And so he believed in Christian liberty, and he preached that. There's accounts where someone came into his pulpit and preached, that you needed to give up all kinds of smoking, and that was the way to serve the Lord. And he basically got up right after him and preached on Christian liberty and used smoking as an example. So was not afraid of a confrontation. And then finally, under that point, he was very principled. So does anyone have any idea? So he came under a lot of controversy throughout his kind of career. He was constantly attacked. He was, like I said, at 22, was the largest pastor of the largest church in England. So he was, the media was always writing about him. But does anyone have any idea what was maybe controversial about Spurgeon at the time?
He was certainly accused of being a hyper-Calvinist.
Yes, that was one thing. Him being a Calvinist at all was somewhat controversial to people. Yeah, so a couple things. So that's one. Calvinism in general is one. He he was a strong Calvinist. He said, there's a quote where he says, "The doctrine of Calvinism did not spring from Calvin. We believe that it sprang from the great founder of all truth." So he didn't necessarily believe that it was a Calvinist thing. He just thought this was the Bible. And he thought, so there's that. He was very strongly opposed to infant baptism. So he believed in believer's baptism, which was actually somewhat controversial with kind of where he came from. So that was somewhat controversial. Very opposed to slavery and very outspoken against it. So this is the 1860s, 1870s in England, and that cost him quite a few book sales, but he kind of willingly suffered the loss of that. There's the downgrade controversy. Has anyone ever heard of that? Does that ring a bell? So there was a controversy in the 1880s, and it kind of parallels some of the things I think we're going through today, where essentially kind of liberal thought came into the church and said, look, there are new ways to interpret the Bible. We can interpret it with science, and this is when evolutionary theory and different things were coming up. And so he coined it the downgrade controversy because he said that they were downgrading the importance of the Bible. And so this was a huge deal. This is like probably the biggest formal controversy in the time that he was a pastor. But he left the Baptist Union over it, which was a huge deal at the time. So it'd be like leaving the SBC maybe. But he completely left the Baptist Union. It caused huge stir. I think he did it in an interesting way. I mean, he wrote letters and tried to talk to the guys and really went through. It was a very painful thing for him to do, but he felt that it was very necessary. And so all of that stuff, it was very controversial, but he was always willing to take the hit, when it came to sales of his books or sermons or popularity, to do kind of what he believed was right, which is definitely encouraging. And then lastly, he was just a righteous man. So his life was marked by holiness and his walk with the Lord, and particularly prayer. Many, many, many quotes and people talking about his prayer life. He was kind of a funny man. If you read his stuff or read accounts of him, he's just kind of a quirky, funny guy. And there are accounts where he would be walking with a friend and they're laughing and stuff, and he says, "Come, let's thank God for laughter." And they drop to their knees and they would give thanks for laughter. So his whole life was marked by prayer, even in the little things, which is really cool. And was definitely an encouragement to me. There are some incredible prayers you can read. He would kind of ask people not to write down his prayers because he didn't want it to become this. But if you find instances of his prayers to his congregation, it's just incredible, just very loving, and where he's basically saying, protect these sheep, don't hold the bad shepherd myself accountable, the sins of me for my sheep. Just incredible man, very righteous, and just an excellent prayer life. Yes. Oh, is that a baby? I'm sorry. Question. All right. So with that, let me ask this question. When I say celebrity pastor, what comes to mind? Describe it. What images, what characteristics come to mind when I say celebrity pastor? Surely you have something. Skinny jeans, okay. What are the characteristics that we typically associate with celebrity pastors? What's that? Name it and claim it, okay.
Waving the Bible around but not opening it.
That's a good one, yep. Rich, okay.
Wanting to be the center of attention.
Center of attention. Anything else?
Becoming like the world under the guise of appealing to the world for winning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, constantly kind of following the culture. Yeah, so in a lot of ways, I would say Charles Spurgeon was kind of by definition a celebrity pastor of his day, but with a lot of distinction from maybe how we would describe a celebrity pastor today. He, on paper at least, was a celebrity pastor. He was an incredibly popular person. Everyone knew his name. He was kind of a boy wonder who came up with no education and was an incredible speaker and an incredible writer, and not just an incredible speaker and an incredible writer, but also the director of 1,000 different organizations that I'll read. I mean, he founded all of these different organizations within his church that went out and did amazing work. He edited a monthly magazine and his sermons, and he responded to 500 letters a week and did all of these incredible things. His church was huge. He was a celebrity pastor, and yet very unlike what we might think of a celebrity pastor. But it does help, I think, as you hear about his life to realize that this is not a person who is sitting in a small church in England in the 1800s that we just read about now, but he was the center of attention kind of everywhere that he went. His friends were H.J. Heinz of the Heinz ketchup place, which was that was his kind of American friend, and others. So he was a big deal, and he was probably a bigger deal than we think he is now, just because we know the name because of his theology. But he was a huge deal who was in the media all the time. So much so that he would have to, before he got married, there were reports coming out that essentially all of the single females would come and just line the pews and would give him gifts and things, and he would have to write to his parents and tell them it's not true, but that was the type of thing that was coming up even at the time, which I think is just helpful context because it's not really how we think about someone like a Charles Spurgeon. He was referred to as the Prince of Preachers, and just a couple physical characteristics. He was known for kind of two physical things. His expressions. He was known to just have a face that was incredibly emotive. So he was, someone said, could any face more fully express geniality, friendliness, warmth of affection, or overflowing hospitality? So he was a very warm and inviting person who was very expressive. And then his voice. One of the things that I think is the most frustrating is that I read all of these beautiful accounts of just his voice and what it sounded like, and yet we can't ever hear it. But it said, his voice being an organ in itself of amazing compass and sweetness of modulation, his speech was music. The voice was perfect control, and though it could thunder with startling force, it could also speak the most moving, gentle tones. It was often described as the chime of silver bells. Just an incredible, beautiful description of his voice. And you can imagine preaching to 10, 20,000 people with no microphone. I couldn't probably speak to you with no microphone. I mumble and I mutter, but he had this booming voice that was also gentle, and you just get the sense of almost this kind of lion who was this incredibly powerful person behind the pulpit, but wasn't just that. He was also a loving pastor individually to his congregation. And speaking of that congregation, his church membership reached 6,000, and he knew almost all of them by name. That was his goal, to know them all by name. And so you think about all of the other things he's doing, and he's also pastoring to that degree. He would constantly meet with people, and on the weekends wanted to go visit with people individually. He had a very, he had almost like a gauntlet of what it would take for him to allow a person to be baptized and to come in as a church member. He did not believe in getting, as many as he could. He really put them to the test, and he wasn't going to baptize someone who he didn't believe truly was regenerated. And so, when we talk about celebrity pastor, his church was unbelievable in terms of numbers and membership that was steady. But he was not trying to go get numbers for the sake of numbers. He really, truly wanted regeneration and then, to train people up, which is really cool. If you were, I think, absent from church for like 3 months, you were off the roll. You were no longer a member. So he had a very tight church membership process. Later on in the church membership or in the church stage, he would train up his elders essentially to go out and to do these interviews. But he cared very deeply that people weren't just coming into the church and kind of forgotten about or weren't truly regenerate. Here's a controversial one, and I would love to hear some thoughts on this. So Spurgeon sold seats. So you mentioned about paying for your seat. So if you were one of the 3,000 people who regularly attended, you paid for your seats in 3-month increments. And that was part of kind of the funds of the church. So what do you think about that? Because I don't know what I think of that, so. It does, that's what I thought too. That's exactly what I thought, yeah. Yeah, it is not something I thought Spurgeon would do, but that money didn't go into his pocket. Maybe that's the good thing there. Non-paying attendees would be allowed in 5 minutes before the sermon started. So if you imagine this, you have kind of these gates, you have your 3,000 who come in, who find their paid-for seats, and then there's a mad dash of everyone else to get seats or standing room only before the sermon would start. So
Was there gradations, like if you paid more, you got to sit closer to the front?
I don't know. I don't know. I should have looked that up. That'd be good. I hope there weren't levels of payment, kind of, but
Because I can almost see it being treated like a pre-tithe.
that's kind of how they treated it.
He didn't want people frozen out, but it's details, right?
Yeah, it was interesting how even things like he would encourage his members not to come sometimes to Sunday evening services because there wasn't enough room for non-believers. And that was an interesting one to me because I think, who is the church primarily for? We say the church is for believers. It can be a mission field, but it is primarily for believers. But he would sometimes encourage them not to come so that unbelievers could come in. But hopefully continues to paint a picture of the kind of celebrity pastor that he was, the fact that this wasn't just a small church that no one had heard of. Like this was in some ways a booming business. It was a busy place. It was called Metropolitan Tabernacle, by the way. I think I forgot to mention that. I think
it's really important to realize, though, the paying for there was nothing sinister about it. That's the way it was done. Even, I told you I've got a story on that. And at 12 years old, I went to the Netherlands, and I could not sit with my grandparents until the green light above the pulpit went on. It was a red light. And any visitors that came in, you did not have what they called free seating.
interesting.
And when the green light came on 5 minutes before the service, I could go sit with my grandparents if there was a spot open. So there's really nothing sinister about it. It's the way the church raised its money. And I think that's a good comment. It's probably pre-tithe or
Yeah.
it was viewed as some of the tithe. It's just the way it was done. There's obviously other ways to take care of that, but it's just an interesting time and an interesting way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think because we have pastors who do this kind of thing for personal gain, you hear something like that and you think, that's wrong, But I think when you look at his life, he refused a salary from the church. He was often given money and told, go spend this on yourself. Take your wife, go on vacation, do something for yourself. He would almost always immediately turn around and give it to something. So, yeah, great comment. Yeah, yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and it probably was not controversial at all in the day. It sounds weird to us now, but, and I did want to say to your point, Spurgeon caring for the poor, and I think this ties in a little bit. We might talk about this in a minute, but he certainly did care for the poor. He had almshouses that he founded. And so just to kind of give a glimpse into what some of this money was used for and some of the things that the church was doing at the time. So he had a pastor's college that he ran, essentially training up pastors, almshouses, orphanages. He founded something called the Coal Porters Association, which was a group of men who would go out and evangelize. He was running the Sword and the Trowel magazine at the time. And then just listen to this list. These are other things that were, and I don't know anything about most of these, but just listen to this list. These are things that came out of Metropolitan Tabernacle that to some degree he had a hand in founding or was a part of the operations. The Evangelists Association, the Country Mission, the Home and Foreign Working Society, the Loan Tract Society, the Sermon Loan Society, the Maternal Society, the Police Mission, the Coffee House Mission, the Loan Building Fund, the Christian Brothers Benefit Society, the Flower Mission, the Gospel Temperance Society, the Female Servants Home Society, the Blind Society, the Ladies Benevolent Society, the Tabernacle Evangelistic Society, and the Spurgeon Sermons Tract Society. That doesn't include his wife's ministry, who ran a book. She was disabled to some degree, and she ran a book ministry from the home. So you think about that, plus the role of a pastor, all these different things, gives you some idea of kind of where this money was going, but also what the church was doing at the time. So. Yeah.
To pay for your seat, and it seems like, he has to have staff for all these societies.
Yeah.
You're expected to be involved in the work of the kingdom.
Yeah.
On a non-Sunday basis.
Yeah, like I said, he had this principle that everything in the Lord's work be done well. And he really, he expected that, I think, from his people. And nothing that I've read makes that sound contentious at all. I think people were wanting to do these things, but they said the church was basically open from like 6 in the morning to 11 at night every day of the week, and it was just going nonstop. I think I had a stat here where it said, I think Sunday evenings, the Metropolitan Tabernacle programs got to be so big that it was said that like 1,000 people were leading something to some degree connected with the tabernacle every Sunday evening. So that's not partaking of, that's to some degree leading, which doesn't sound real to me in my head. Like that doesn't make sense to me in my head, but I mean that's what they said. So I mean in either case it was a buzzing place. I think they described it as a hive at some point. Like it was just always going and always doing some type of work.
I heard too, I read somewhere, but it said sometimes when you preach as much as
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't write it down, but you can easily go online and find his schedule of the week and look at his Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and look at either what he preached or taught, and it's unbelievable. And the fact that he then found time to write books and do these different things is just staggering. Church had no choir and no organ too, so somebody would stand up and set the pitch with a tuning fork, and then everyone would sing, which I thought was kind of cool too. All right. Let's see. A couple more numbers, just because. His personal library was over 12,000 books. He had this almost encyclopedic recall and knowledge. So at an early age, he could pretty much recall any portion of the Bible and recite it back. He had lots and lots of hymns memorized that he could kind of immediately pull out of the air, to quote. But he also read a lot of theology, and so he just, if you think about, and I'm not this way at all, so it's amazing to me to think about, but when he was speaking or talking to someone, he had this library in his head that he could recall at any point, and he could kind of go and pull something from it. And I think that's one of the things that makes a lot of his writing so good, is he's pulling from all these different areas. And you'll see in a lot of his recounts and his writings, he pulls from hymns quite a bit. There is a Fountain Filled with Blood was, I think, a favorite. He pulls from that a bunch, but also a lot of others. He wrote about 150 books in his lifetime, including The Treasury of David, which is multiple books. The Treasury of David was considered kind of his magnum opus. Is that the term I'm looking for, maybe? Seven series volume commentary on the Psalms. It took him a while to write. I want to say about 20 years to write. And it is considered, supposedly incredible. It's just this big, long commentary on the Psalms. And that's kind of his crowning achievement of writing. His books sold 6 million copies in the first 6 years of his ministry. Think about the 1800s, 6 million copies in his first few years of ministry is pretty amazing. He would preach 4 to 6 times a week, sometimes up to 10, and he would average 6 books a week, like reading 6 books a week. So he would, in the, I think, mid-1860s, he started this thing called The Sword and the Trowel magazine. Sword and the Trowel being the two things that he thought kind of characterized the life of a Christian, and particularly pastor. Sword, I think, being a reference to the Bible, defending the faith, but also the trowel being the work, the what you need to just get to work. He would physically use the trowel often because his church was planting so many different buildings and all the societies that we talked about, that he would lay the foundation stones so often they engraved him his own trowel, and it was said like he was very adept at getting down and laying the first stone because he did it all the time. But he started this monthly magazine called The Sword and the Trowel, and in it he would do, it's kind of, I think of it like kind of like Table Talk, but it was a monthly magazine where he would do book reviews and writings to pastors. I can't remember if his sermons were actually published in there, but that became something that was run through the rest of his life. So he read about 6 books a week and would review many of those. He would respond to about 500 letters a week. When he would go on vacation, so he had health issues for a lot of his life. He had, I think, gout and some other issues, and he would often have to travel out of England to go to warmer climates for brief periods of time to recuperate. When he would go on vacation or would go on these trips, they would find him preaching to crowds of 10,000, 15,000 people on hillsides in Scotland or wherever. And he was also bedridden at one point, to where he couldn't even roll over without intense pain. And it's a really incredible story, particularly because he and his wife both had really bad health issues. And he writes about kind of the worst of his health issues and how he could not move in the bed because he was he would hurt so badly. And he had all these people in there helping him and doing these things. And he gets so angry that he says, everybody get out. And he recounts his prayer at that time. He prays this beautiful prayer where he says essentially, Lord, I'm your child, you're my father, and if I saw my child hurting like I'm hurting, I would do anything to stop him from hurting. And I can't go on. I feel it's unbearable. And this is incredibly beautiful prayer. And he says he finishes praying and he feels like I'll never experience this pain again. And he never experienced that pain from that day on. And just an incredible testament, I think, to a man who had complete reliance and kind of knew where to go, and wasn't afraid to pray things like that, and was known for praying things like that for others. But really, really sweet prayer. So he struggled with health issues. Let's see, we talked about all of the things he started. I guess before I go on, any questions, comments? I've been talking for a while, so.
Did you come across, before when we talked about him, the depression was what was foremost in my mind, because looking to relate so much, but from everything you said, I mean, I know what it's like to live with someone who is suffering from depression, and to me, I was wondering if that came about in any of the other health things you talked about, or?
Yes, it did. So the book that I read, I'm trying to find if I wrote down the page number of a quote that he had on depression.
It was very much an encouragement to look and to know that about him, but after hearing all of this, I'm wondering, did they say anything about it?
Yeah, they did. And a lot of his depression, I think, was linked somewhat to his physical condition. He had a really, really sweet quote, and if I can't find it, I'll send it to you, on his depression and how I'm not going to be able to find it right now, but I will find it. But he had this really incredible quote about how when he was kind of in the throes of depression, and a verse came to mind, and he started laughing. And I think it was, "My grace is sufficient for thee." And he started laughing and maybe crying, and he said, I think it probably is, Lord, that it is sufficient for these things, and how it turned his depression into joy. And I talked about how he was a kind of a funny man, kind of prone to being pretty humorous. But it was this really sweet account of him going from this very depressed state to joy in the Lord. But I'll find that, and I'll send that over. Other questions?
So Ryan, you talked about the Treasure of David being that 7-volume set. Just to show you Spurgeon's heart, it wasn't just about Spurgeon. If you look at those expositions that he did on the Psalms, in the back of every Psalm, he's got a thing there that's called Notes to the Country Preacher. So he was trying to help anybody, wherever they might be, when they come across those volumes, that the country preacher
Yeah.
Was it the brain that he was? They are phenomenal volumes. Even today, they're great.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it wasn't just Treasury of David, I think, that he did that. He was, if you look at the Sword and the Trowel, the account that I wrote about, that I read about the founding of the Sword and the Trowel was kind of for that reason. It was, there are pastors out there who get the sermons like everyone else, but they don't have some of the other direction as pastors. And so it was kind of, in some sense, founded to be an encouragement to pastors. His wife also ran a book ministry, and it was essentially to do that. It was to provide books to pastors who didn't have a church fund to do that. And so she would receive books or buy books herself and then send them out to small country churches or pastors who didn't have book budgets and didn't have resources and get them in the hands, and it became this big thing. So that's a great point. Any other questions or anything you want to discuss?
Do you happen to know what his views on eschatology were? I think he's one of these guys that everyone wants to claim because he was never real specific about it. So I think multiple camps kind of know he's with me. I don't know if you had any. Obviously, you know him pretty well. I think you had any thoughts.
I don't. Do you want him to be post-mill?
A lot of people claim it to be post-mill, but
Yeah,
it could be historic pre-mill and others. So I was just curious.
I don't. Sorry, I have nothing on that.
I think it was a work in progress during that time. There was a lot of different views out there.
Yeah.
Not sure it was clarified.
Yeah, I didn't read anything definitive on that, and it seemed to be the things that he was definitive on. It was very clear, and I didn't read anything about that. So
His Puritan background, he was pretty tight with the Hodges.
yeah,
Worked with, so
yeah,
maybe, I'm hopeful.
Well, it also sounds like he was very much focused on, doesn't really matter, change the work that I'm to do now. And so he was doing that. It's also, it's amazing to me as you're talking, just thinking of your theme of the celebrity pastor and how the celebrity pastor is about amplifying their message.
that's right.
You know, in terms of, you know, it goes multi-site church, then, you know,
Yep.
streaming the broadcast and everything. And what's interesting is how he was reproducing churches. He was saying, hey, my church should limit, he was trying to limit the size of his church and equip other churches to do the work. And
Yeah,
it's by both planting and, like you said, equipping other pastors. And that's really
the pastor's college alone, where the purpose was really train up pastors and send them out. They were, Spurgeon was very careful about, counting someone a Christian without, proof and without fruit. And the pastors that went out from him were very, very similar. They had kind of checks that they would go through, and they weren't just trying to get numbers. And yet, I think, and I don't have it in front of me, I think it was like within 12 years, they counted kind of the baptisms of these pastors that would go out, and it was like 39,000 or something. I mean, just incredible numbers. And so, yes, he was pushing out to go out and plant churches and spread, very anti what we think of as, celebrity pastor.
It feels like the modern equivalent. The closest, as you're describing him, it feels a lot like John MacArthur, like put on steroids. Like, to put it in a little bit of a modern context.
Yeah. From a number standpoint, I've just never seen anything close to the numbers that I read about with him.
So you're talking about training then for the ministry. He did not have theological training.
That's right.
Yet he had this passion to properly train them for the ministry. His book, Lectures to My Students,
Yeah.
is a very worthwhile book to read, even for the lay person. You get Spurgeon's humor, you get Spurgeon's logic in there, and really it's an easy read, but it is at the same time profound. You get a
Yeah, I read a lot about, I didn't read that, but I read a lot about lectures to my students, and it spoke very highly, and is another testament to the fact that, I think pastors probably have a tendency to be either relational or great preachers, and he was both, and he was incredibly relational even in training the pastors. And it talked about how he would come into the pastor's college, into the lessons, and just spend time with them and joke around with them, and how he would kind of mock some of their tendencies and, good fun, but that he was truly desiring to help teach them and grow them, and then he would sit and pray with them and pray for them. And it's just really amazing when you think about what his schedule was like, that he would make the time not just to be there and to show his face, but to be so intentional with these men. I don't think anyone has brought props yet for one of these, so just really quick, this is what we'll end. I'm getting no money from this, but shameless plug. There's a guy. So this was the seal that Spurgeon had printed on the bindings of his books later in his life. So it's "We preach Christ and Him crucified" around the other side. This being Moses and the bronze serpent here. And there's a guy who runs this company called A Pilgrim's Coffer, and he produces these, and is really he is really trying to get people to read more Spurgeon and other men like him. I would encourage you to check out his website because he's got some really cool things. There's also something I found. I think Spurgeon is one of those people. I've been convicted of this, studying this. Spurgeon's fascinating to me, but I tend to get just caught up in the man and the biography and the life that he lived and the things that he did. And I haven't actually read a lot of Spurgeon. There have been times in my life where I've read things from him or gone through different books in pieces. He's one of the theologians that people tend to quote a lot, just in little snippets, because he was such a beautiful writer that he has just little short, sentences that cut really deep and really get to the heart, and I think they're fantastic. I would like to read more of his work, but I wanted to share one funny thing. There's another company called Reftoons, and it's this guy that just does cartoons of these old reformers. And he has these bookmarks, and the bookmark says, it's a Charles Spurgeon quote, and it's a little cartoon of Spurgeon with his big beard and his kind of roundliness. But the quote is, "Visit many good books, but live in the Bible." Just a really cool bookmark to have, and a really great quote, I think, which kind of defines Spurgeon. I mean, he was a very driven man who accomplished a lot, but never lost sight of the reason that he was doing all of these things, and the intentionality and why he was doing this stuff. So probably a good place to end. There's a lot. If you're interested, you're welcome to borrow this book. There's tons you can read online, but really fascinating man, and just again, his life's work carried eternal weight. And I don't want to lose sight of that, when we leave. So I'm going to pray and break. Father in heaven, thank you for this evening and the opportunity to learn about a great man of the faith. We pray that tonight we'd be encouraged by just the steadiness and steadfastness of a walk with the Lord, that we would desire to be earnest in our daily work, our daily life, in our families, and in our witness to others, Lord. I pray that you would prepare us for this week ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.